Welcome back to Takacs McGinnis Elder Care Law Hour. I'm Tim Takacs, and in today's show we're talking about chronic illnesses and diseases and how they affect your planning.
And I'm Barbara McGinnis. In this segment we're going to be visiting with Patty Lane, who is the Director of Care Services for the Tennessee Chapter of ALS. Welcome, Patty.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Let's start by just, what is ALS?
Well, ALS is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and it is a progressive degenerative neuromuscular disease. Essentially, the motor neurons die, and so therefore the brain is sending signals for the body to move, but the body doesn't move because it's not receiving it. And that can happen gradually, and it can affect some muscles and not all muscles, but or eventually someone can be completely paralyzed.
So you've got an active brain up here, you know, and then you have no, basically it's like the wires are short-circuiting, or they're gone.
Yes.
You know, down to the rest of the body.
And there is a small portion, maybe there's varying quotes, but 10 to 20% that might have an overlap with frontotemporal dementia as well. So some clients also have some mental challenges as well.
Okay. So what are some of the early warning signs, or how do you know if that you might have ALS?
Well, it's difficult. Oftentimes it can take up to a year to get a diagnosis because the symptoms are so benign. It may be that you go to pick up the cup and you drop it, or you have weakness in your hand. You might stumble because you're dragging a foot, have foot drop. A lot of times they just kind of put people in a brace and send them on. Or sometimes they may have some speech issues and not quite sure. They might think they've had a stroke, nothing comes back. So there's no markers for the disease, so it can be difficult to get a diagnosis. You kind of have to, one of the doctors used to explain is you have to let the flower open to be able to recognize what it is.
And probably a lot of ruling out other things.
Absolutely. That's how you diagnose, is you rule out everything else and then look at the clinical picture that's presented.
Right. Is there a particular age group that's sensitive to this?
Well, the parameters have always been between 40 and 70 for diagnosis.
Oh, that's pretty broad. Yeah.
We have seen much younger people and older people as well have the diagnosis.
So is it more prevalent in like the between 40 and 70, or is it? I'm just thinking, I'm 63 and I'm going, okay, am I outside the risk zone, or?
Well, they've done some recent studies, and it's more predominant, slightly more predominant in men, generally more predominant in Caucasians. It can affect any socioeconomic, any educational background, any nationality, anywhere in the world, but predominantly skews a little bit more towards Caucasian men. I often wonder if it's because veterans are twice as likely as the general population to contract ALS. We do not know why yet, but that could potentially skew that as well. So some athletes as well.
Okay. So how do I keep from getting it? What can I do?
There's not any good answers for that either. There's a lot of unanswered questions with ALS. 90% of people that have ALS contract it sporadically. About 10% have it run in their families. So it's very hard to predict who will get it. And along the way, it's very hard to predict how it's going to affect you as well. You know, it may have a very slow progression. It can have a very rapid progression and then plateau. So that's so devastating for families when they are faced with it, because you don't really know. You know, they come to us and say oftentimes, what's going to happen next?
And it's hard.
The doctors may be able to guess at that, but it's very difficult in general to give you that answer.
So then almost anything that you ask after that, the answer could be, it depends. Life expectancy, or it does sound like there's no cure for ALS.
Yes, it is. At this point, there is no cure. It is a fatal disease. And the general life expectancy is 2 to 5 years from the point of diagnosis. I have had a client pass away as quickly as 6 months after the diagnosis, and I have another client who has had the disease for 33 years and is able to live independently at home. Now he has help, but he's not in a facility and he lives alone.
And I believe probably the most prominent person that we know of that had also ALS was
Stephen Hawking.
Yes. So, and he had it, like, I guess he had contracted it as a young man.
I think in his 20s.
In his 20s. So he was
in college.
50 years plus, perhaps.
Absolutely.
So.
A lot of variety there.
Right. And we all know how active and how, you know, that, I guess, obviously, in some ways, life-limiting for him, but in other ways, maybe that was, you know, maybe he did his best work.
When everything else is kind of shutting down, the brain can...
So what about the equipment? What kind of special equipment or home modifications should folks start thinking about if they're diagnosed and we're wanting to live at home as long as possible?
Well, definitely home modification is important because they may well end up in a power wheelchair. So they're going to need to look at ramping. They're going to need to look at bathrooms. You know, a roll-in shower can really increase your independence. It's not something that most of us have. And we're talking completely flat roll-in, not just a little step over, because oftentimes that little step is something that you can't make. So equipment-wise, you know, power wheelchairs, any kind of assistive aids, lift chairs, Hoyer lifts.
Hoyer lifts are
lifts that if you are completely unable to transfer from bed to chair, it is a crank or an electronic model that you put a sling under the person and it lifts them off the bed and transfers them over to the chair. Now, oftentimes people will look at those power chairs as a progression of their disease and they fight them. So that's a lot of what we do, is try to get them to think ahead and kind of reframe how they look at that as this is something that's going to add to your independence. It's going to prevent falls. It's going to allow you to go wherever you want to go, pretty much. And instead of...
It's a tool.
It's a tool, absolutely.
Which has utility for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some people also lose the ability to speak and communicate, so that's a huge thing, is just assistive technology for communication. Anywhere from, a lot of folks these days are using their phones. We have a support group where 2 of the members are talking, you know, via their phone. iPads work, and then all the way up to if a person is paralyzed and cannot use a touch screen, you can use an eye gaze device, which they operate with their eyes, and they can spell out words.
And I think that's what Stephen Hawking had, wasn't it? He was able to communicate that way.
Yes.
So how much does this stuff cost? I mean, we're talking about a lot of equipment. Who pays for that?
It can be very expensive. I think a power chair can be $30,000. The eye gaze device can be $15,000. So usually people with ALS can qualify for Social Security disability and Medicare if they've had enough work quarters. A lot of times you'll get into situations where people don't have that, and that's devastating. It's very important that they have a secondary insurance, because a copay on a $30,000 chair is no small drop in the bucket. So, so again, usually they have to rely on disability, and some people have additional resources.
And if I recall, I believe ALS is what Social Security calls a presumptive condition, which means if you have a diagnosis, then essentially you automatically get it. And I think isn't that one where there's no waiting period for Medicare?
It's a 5-month delay for the benefits.
Medicare.
Yes. And then versus a two years.
Okay, we've just got like maybe a minute left, Patty. So can you tell us about what the ALS Association does here in Middle Tennessee and the services that provide?
We try to be a resource for them for anything related to their ALS. We have a support group. We have loan closets for communication and medical equipment. We have a respite program. We have. We also look at ourselves as care service coordinators as a program, because we go in there and help them navigate the healthcare system. Potentially we could go in and see someone's having significant breathing issues and say, don't wait for your next clinic appointment. You need to get in and see your pulmonologist now to get some respiratory intervention, which can also affect folks.
Right. So how do we get in touch with you?
Well, the office is here in Nashville.
Got your contact information.
Yeah, and we have a lot of different educational materials and different events as well. So appreciate support that way too.
Great.
I don't know, we may have time for, is there any research trials going on locally?
Well, I don't think there's any currently going on in Nashville. I think there's one in Memphis and one in Knoxville. St. Jude's is also doing some research, table research.
Great, thank you.
Great.
Patty, thanks for sharing this information about ALS with us. So up next, we'll be speaking with a representative of the Mid-South chapter of the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. So stay tuned.